In the heart of the winelands lies the university town of Stellenbosch. Rich in rugby history and tradition, it's also the home of Mr Rugby, Daniël Craven, who celebrated his 80th birthday at the Stellenbosch Town Hall. Many friends and invited guests from around the world attended the dinner to pay tribute to Doc. Amongst the distinguished arrivals were Welsh scrum half Gareth Edwards and the giant All Black forward Colin Meads. Doc's birthday party was also a fundraiser to boost the Craven Trust for underprivileged rugby players. Guest speaker for the evening was another Marty, Dr. Davie de Villiers, a former Springbok captain and scrum half.
South Africa has many rugby players whose achievements and triumphs on the rugby field and beyond can be traced back to the personality, the influence, yes, the invincible hand of Danie Craven. For this, Doc, we salute you.
This, then, is the story of the good doctor. Stellenbosch and the house of Obas Marcotta, South Africa's grandfather of rugby. Following in his footsteps, Dr. Daniël Hartman Craven.
When I became 65 and I had to move out and leave my post as lecturer, I was professor here and I held the chair and I was head of the Department of Physical Education. And when I left, they said, well, there are many of our houses which you can rent. And one is, and when they named me the houses, and one was Mr. Marcotta's old house, I said, that's the one.
A.F. Marcotta, known simply as Obas Mark, is a legend at Marty's. As a player, captain, coach and Springbok selector, he was one of the few men outside Danie Craven's family to influence his career. But many of Doc's attributes stem from his early childhood.
I was born on the farm, Steeton, when the house girl had to go and call my father when it was time for me to be born. But before he arrived, I was already in the world. And I think I've been like that ever since. I've never kept people waiting. If I wanted to do a thing, I did it. And I battled my way out myself to come into this world.
Sport was in the family blood. His father James, farming in the district of Lindley in the Free State, was a keen sportsman, excelling at soccer and cricket. His mother Maria was a school teacher, whose strength of character left an indelible impression on the young Danie.
And she was in a concentration camp for 2 of the concentration camps. And I must say that if there was an outstanding lesson I learned from them, it was this, that he said there must be no grievances, no animosity. All is fair in love and war. What happened in the war is something of the past, and there's no use living in the past. We must look at the future.
His early education began on the farm school Chicago. In 1924, he entered high school in Lindley. Here he struck up a firm friendship with Christian Stimme.
He was a burly little chap, sturdily built. I was thin and small, lightweight. But a friendship sort of immediately sprang up between the two of us, in spite of the fact I couldn't play rugby, and he was born for rugby.
Doc played for the Lindley Town first team at the tender age of 16, but his love for the game of rugby began whilst attending the farm school.
One day it so happened that I was in town and I went with my elder brother, who had a profound influence on my life because he'd always been more advanced than we were in everything, and took me to a rugby match. And Ermelo, town of Ermelo, was playing there. They won tour and they played against Lindley. I didn't know anything about the game. All I can remember is that Lindley won because of the wing tearing down the line and going over for a try. And that to me made a wonderful impression on me, that game. And somehow it just stirred something in me, roused something in me. That is my game.
Study took second place to rugby, and yet he managed to pass matric in 1928.
And there we were fortunate in having some very fine teachers, real highly qualified gentlemen who taught us not only English and Afrikaans and maths and whatnot, but also a way of life. You know, we in the countryside, well, in our cultural background, we were sort of, if I may put it that way, we were brought up on the 4 R's, you know, reading, writing, arithmetic, and religion. And our code of ethics and general code of behavior was strong, but certainly not dogmatic or burdensome. We had quite a happy youth.
But when I came to Stellenbosch after matric, my headmaster was an ex-Dagbreek student here at Stellenbosch. He came and said, no, you go to Wilgenhof, hostel there. I think you'll fit in much better there. I've told Mr. Makotta about you. And this English master of mine, who had been Mr. Makotta's chauffeur, when he was here at Stellenbosch, also in Wilgenhof, he knew Mr. Makotta well. He came also to see him. He said, I'm sending a Springbok to you at Stellenbosch. Both of them told Mr. Makotta that.
In those days, one studied at university to become either a teacher or a minister of the church. Doc chose theology, but rugby had a far greater calling under the watchful eye of Mr. Makotta.
It so happened that we played our trials for the under-19s in rain, the pouring rain. And then the next day, I must have played fairly well in their minds, because the next day the second team scrum-half didn't turn up. And they said, where do we get the scrum-half? And these fellows from Wilgenhof said, well, Craven is running on the side field there. He's a scrum-half, and they called me in. And then he said to somebody, who's that a fellow behind the scrum there? And they said, Craven. They said to one of the coaches, I think it was Dr. Chase, but you don't play him for the first team. I want to keep him for the Springbok team of 1931.
At these Springbok trials, Danie Craven was picked for the tour to Great Britain and France, but without having even represented his province. On tour, Danie was just like any other player, representing his country for the first time.
I was as nervous as could be. But when I felt the turf under my feet, it left me. And I was prepared for anything. I nearly died before the first international I played against Wales, at Swansea, at St Helens. I nearly went to Theopina, our manager, to ask him to withdraw my name from the team. But I thought, no, that would be in conformity with the name you have, Craven, which means a coward, and which was something that also worried me throughout my life until a certain stage.
The tour was an unqualified success, but a fateful incident during the last test against the Scots at Murrayfield caused Danie Craven to change his academic course at Stellenbosch University.
When I came back, I was still hoarse from the kick I received on my vocal cords. And I went to see a doctor and he said, you better change your course. You can never become a parson. And I had to change my course. And I think the pulpit is still pleased that something had happened to Craven. Changing a direction in midstream was no easy matter. Now, what do I do? And General Smith, it so happened that General Smith gave a talk here at Stellenbosch, and he said to us, he said, you students, I appeal to you to come and help me to solve the native question, as it was called in those days. I said, come and help me to solve the native question. And then I said, well, one of my majors was anthropology. That is the direction I'll take. It was actually after his address to the students here that I took the MA then in anthropology.
While Danie was completing his doctorate in anthropology, his rugby career flourished. He was a regular member of both Western Province, Marties, and a stalwart of the Springboks, especially in the Test Series win against the touring Wallabies in 1933.
He was dynamic, he had great physical strength, and he drew the attention of more than one player, which always made it easier for the rest of the team. He was a match winner in his own right and could dominate a game.
In 1937, the Springboks toured Australia and New Zealand. Danie Craven, astonishingly, was picked as fly half for the first test against the Wallabies.
5 of the players were selectors actually for the team, which isn't a good thing. And we had 2 fly halves in the first test against Australia, Tony Harris and Van der Favour, who were chosen as fly halves, but the committee thought they weren't up to test match standard, and Craven was brought in to play fly half. I don't think it was a good idea, but that's what they decided, and we just managed to win that first test.
The South Africans returned as one of the greatest teams ever to tour abroad. They played 26 matches and won 24, and are still the only Springbok team to win a Test series against New Zealand in their own backyard. The following year, a team from the British Isles toured South Africa, and in that side was the English fly half Jeff Reynolds.
My opposite number in the Test, anyway, was Tony Harris, and I thought he was jolly lucky because the Doc would get his grass out, with his dive pass, and gave him every time and space to work in. And I must say I had a very good scrum half working with me. It was not quite the same as what was going on the other side. It wasn't as good, but he was always thinking of what to do. He never had a set piece, as it were. If it was the scrum, it wasn't always just going on the blind side, but if it was going about, it was some other feature that would happen that would put the opposition off time.
England lost the first test in Port Elizabeth and the series 3-1. Sadly, it was the last time Doc would pull on the green and gold for South Africa due to the advent of the Second World War. After teaching for 2 years in Grahamstown, he joined the army as Director of Physical Training. While in Pretoria, he played for Northern Transvaal, the third province after Western and Eastern Province to benefit from his talents as a player and a leader. Doc had announced his engagement to Mayra Hayward in 1937, and the following year they were married in the Dutch Reformed Church in Stateleville. They were divorced in 1974. When the war clouds gathered, Doc was in Europe, having taken leave to further his education concerning physical training. He attended a number of courses throughout Europe before returning to South Africa just after the outbreak of the Second World War. Doc's pride and joy was the Physical Training Battalion, the PTB. Under his command, more than 4,000 underprivileged boys graduated from the battalion. On Doc's request to Smuts, the battalion was transferred from the military to the Department of Education, which necessitated a move from Pretoria to Kimberley, but not for long. In spite of Jannie Smuts' support for the battalion, Doc's dreams for the PTB were shattered by the nationalists coming to power.
General Smuts and Jannie Hofmeyer wanted us to go into this direction. They said they're not there anymore. Then I knew that was the end of the story. I called my staff together and I said to them, I have a feeling and a premonition that this is the end of the old PTB. And we will now have to fend for ourselves. They'll get rid of us one by one. I'm all right. I've got a job. I hope you're also good. But they're well-qualified people. So we broke up, and I came then to Stellenbosch. And that's how I came here. But that's how politics killed. The most wonderful thing, to my mind, that ever happened in South Africa for youngsters. So I must always stop myself from becoming bitter. That was the best time of my life. one thing I realized, that when apartheid was introduced, I said, God help us. Things are going to happen in this country about which we'll all feel sorry, and things which could have stopped without apartheid. And therefore I could never ever associate myself with any form of apartheid. I know that one chooses one's own friends. And I know something about evolution. Apartheid threw all that overboard. The result is we've got to start de novo now. We've got to start from scratch. All those things were unnecessary. All those laws pertaining to apartheid were unnecessary because evolution would have seen to it. All we had to do was to conform to the laws of evolution, which we didn't do.
Politically, we differed. I was a nationalist, and he was a SAP, if you know what I mean, the old South African party. And afterwards, the United Party. And I remained a NAT, and he remained a SAP. But that didn't do anything to our friendship. I mean, made no difference at all.
A disillusioned Doc Craven returned to Stellenbosch in 1949. A new era of coaching, politics and asserting his unique style emerged.
I am Stellenbosch, and Stellenbosch is in my blood. It was because here the foundation of my whole rugby career was laid in this place. Firstly, because of the teachers I had who had been trained here at Stellenbosch. And they carried something of Stellenbosch without saying it. Just something that stuck to them, which they also took with them into the country. You know, when Mr Makota, before the turn of the century, he wrote to the Chief Justice of the peace, he wrote, I've decided to devote the rest of my life to rugby football. They blamed him immensely. How could you do it here as an attorney, practicing in Wellington and coming back to Stellenbosch for the sake of rugby football? But he had something else in mind. He argued that if the players at Stellenbosch got the right stamp on them, so I can use that expression, if I can stamp them in the right traditions of the game of rugby, wherever they go, they'll carry it with them. And I think that those teachers were the carriers of rugby traditions and rugby codes, and they imbued me with the right approach to the game. And when I came here, I just felt that here is a background which nothing else could even equal.
Doc was appointed assistant manager to the 1951 Springbok team for the tour to the British Isles and France. In the side was Transvaal centre Des Sinclair, a joker, as Doc soon discovered.
In certain aspects, I was a little bit frivolous. I was one of the younger members of the side, and to me everything was a sort of a joke. I can recall one night we went out to a banquet, and Doc was at the main table. I was sitting at a nearby table, and I asked Jakkals Kiwi to find the power switch. And as Doc was about to get up to speak, Jakkals flipped the switch, and I dived around the table and took his shoes off. Now, Doc got up and delivered the speech, but when he sat down afterwards, he looked around and didn't know where his shoes were, because we had to walk out after that.
But the Springboks took a serious view of life on the field, losing just one of the 26 matches they played.
gedekt deur Will Pruisenberg presies op die middellyn. 'n Loskrim wat ontwikkel daar. Die bal wil nie behoorlik uitkom nie. Die Springbokke probeer hom af nie, maar Gareth Griffiths staat dribbel hom vir 'n vorentoe. Hy sou by 10-3 lyn nou 'n loskrim wat weer 'n keer daar ontwikkel buite kan die kwartfinale van die Springboks span. 'n Loskrim wat ontstaan van volle.
During the 1955 tour of South Africa, Doc's coaching skills came to the fore. The Springbok side, and Doc in particular, left a lasting impression on the young Irish centre, Tony O'Reilly. O'Reilly, 35 years later, organised and paid for a lavish reunion between the two sides at the Mount Nelson Hotel in Cape Town.
You can always feel Danie Craven's presence, particularly his disapproval. Danie has a way of lowering his eyelids that could stop a regiment at 2 miles range. And he had instilled a great sense of discipline into that Springbok team. And I think it came through in the fourth test. We should really have won that fourth test. We were ahead at the half. But that sense of collective pride in their South African heritage, they won't be beaten, came through in the second half, and they really took us apart.
And the strange thing, and people don't believe me, that we didn't train properly, we didn't have a coach, we didn't have tactics. We thought that, a coach was a posh bus. And we thought that something like, we use an excessive embrocation, working on the theory, if you weren't fit, for God's sake, smell fit. And it was just an excuse. I promise you that is absolutely true. And yet we learned so much from the methods of Danie Craven, for instance, because he had this command. And the one word which I believe is missing in lots of life today, not just sport, discipline. That delicate balance between freedom and accountability.
At the young age of 46, Doc was reluctantly elected president of the Rugby Board and duly represented South Africa on the IRB. The first meeting he attended overseas was in 1957. On the boat to Britain, a lonely and unhappy Craven, to relieve his worries, wrote the first of many books on rugby.
There I met great men, who thought, what Bill Ramsey afterwards, a few years afterwards said, he said, I know nothing about the laws of the game, but I know everything about the spirit of the game. And that, to my mind, is still the most important part of rugby, its spirit. They tell every newcomer to the international, or they did in those days, every newcomer to the international board, they said, we like you. And well, that's nice to hear. But they took me into a room and they said, Danie, we trust you.
Perhaps his greatest supporter, then and now, is French rugby president Albert Ferras.
I'm proud to be his friend because, to me, Danie Craven is a monument of rugby. And he's certainly done more for our game than anyone else. We've always got on well. We don't speak the same language, but we have only to look at each other and we understand one another. That's what's extraordinary. Danie Craven has such a stature in South Africa because he's done a lot for rugby, for reunification and against apartheid. And that's been important.
Whilst Doc was immersed in his commitments to rugby administration and politics, he never neglected his duties as coach to the Matis.
I played naturally, and I coached naturally, as the occasion demanded. I mean, every training session is different, because I've never believed in pep talks. Stirring up people and emotions and all that. I've never believed in that. I tried it. It doesn't last. It lasts for 5 minutes. Emotions don't win a match. It's the brain which wins matches. I don't believe in praise songs. If you praise a player, something sticks. And he feels at ease. He should never feel at ease. He should always be on his toes.
I don't care.
I term him as an exciting coach because you never knew from one weekend to the next what was going to be on the agenda. I think so much of rugby today is repetitive and the coaching methods are repetitive. But certainly one thing I remember about Doc, there was always something new and innovative. He was regarded as the great motivator, and he suddenly one day said, you can't really motivate anybody. It's impossible. And we sort of all looked at him with, astonished eyes, and he says, what you can really only do is sort of set the circumstances within which people can motivate themselves. And I think he was a master at that.
But it's the determination of Doc, the way he can convince you that you can do it, that is very important. And I think in that way he managed to build many players, even in inspiring them to reach out beyond their own ability, which make him such a great coach, such a great man.
He's very good with young people, gathering them around them, teaching them not only rugby but a way of life.
I didn't make Stellenbosch Rugby. I only followed in the footsteps of my old mentor, Mr Makota. He made Stellenbosch Rugby. He really, when he returned, he laid the foundation. And therefore, I look upon Stellenbosch Rugby in three eras. The first is the Makota era, dating from the earliest times till the beginning of the 40s, and then I came over and towards the end of the 40s, and that was the Craven era until this year, when I decided to hand over coaching to Dawie Snyman. And now we're going, the third era will be the Snyman era.
How can anybody come and do the job after Doc? I mean, it's what I would like to do is I would just like to make another contribution to the game of rugby football in the first place, to Stellenbosch in the second place, and if I can help anybody, I'll be grateful to do so.
Doc's coaching career was relatively untroubled, but administratively he was tested to the limit. In the late 60s, when anti-apartheid lobbyists led by Peter Hain were gaining strength, the future of South African rugby looked bleak.
Demonstrators proved a constant source of harassment to the Springbok rugby team during their 1969-70 tour of Britain.
Doc's influence, of course, was strong in encouraging us to go on and not to go home as many players wanted us to do. So he provided that kind of stability necessary under such circumstances. He was, he encouraged us to be cool and composed and to concentrate on the game rather, and that was important.
It really hardened my whole attitude towards the whole project which they were launching. I felt it was uncouth, and I think it affected our play too on that tour. The comparison I had to make when I played and now. And that is why, to me, it's uppermost in my mind. I want those two to get together. I want what I had. I want my players to have.
And to this end, Doc was instrumental in moving away from apartheid in rugby. In the late 70s, efforts were made to integrate the association and the federation with the rugby board. The era of non-racial rugby had begun.
Let us rather concentrate on how to win, and then we will do justice to this game, to ourselves, and then rugby will be the adventure it can be.
I believe, and I said so to him at the time, that I believe that he was using South Africa, at least coloured rugby, as an instrument to keep South African rugby in international rugby. That was sort of the impression that I had of him when I met him that first time. Rugby should be played by South Africans, irrespective of their race, their colour or their creed. That has been my stand all these years. Later on, when I learned to know Dr. Craven better, he assisted me in carrying out what I really believed in.
The rugby development program was a major undertaking. A team of dedicated people organised coaching clinics, which still continue today.
I would say Doc is the lifeblood of the team. He's become obsessed with bringing people together. And being 80 years old this year, we're all tremendously glad that he's had so much success with this thing. It doesn't stop with clinics. The clinics is learning the basics of the game, but the whole essence behind the clinics is human relations. We're bringing the boys together. We believe that boys who play together can live together.
To coach is to be an educator. When we brought in the colours and the blacks, I said to them, we've got to be the biggest missionaries as from today, because this is an educational process which will affect them and us. They will do things we don't like, and we'll do things they won't like. Therefore, you just shut up and play the game.
We're no longer interested in asking a person what his race is. We ask, can you play rugby? And if you can't, are you willing to learn to play rugby? Now, I think this is what you're driving at. All this is due to the inspiration given by this one man that we're talking about, Daniël Craven.
But it's not been an easy road for Doc. During the mid-70s, Doc had problems in his own backyard. The annual clash between Stellenbosch and Cape Town universities was cancelled for 3 years due to Stellenbosch's reluctance to open their facilities. Happily, the situation was resolved. During that period of change, Doc remarried in 1975. At this time, his constant efforts to keep South Africa in the international rugby community were slowly being stifled. 1981 marked the last officially sanctioned overseas tour. Added to this, the selection of Errol Tobias in that team caused many problems.
When we selected Tobias, people said, yes, he's just a kafir booty, and all that type of rubbish. But the fact of the matter is, Tobias was a rugby player.
The pressure that Errol was under, people will never know, because in New Zealand, he got letters and he got phone calls from his wife, and I can tell you this now. People saying that they would do things to his children back home and everything. So it was an incredible pressure. Plus, internally, in the tour party, we had pressure from the very conservative people internally, and the administrators who were very, very, very conservative. And Errol was playing with players also that didn't want him to be in the touring side.
I've been very angry, disappointed, because I really felt we could have done so much better on that tour. Like you all know, I never had a chance to play centre. Rob was played once out of position, and then suddenly he was dropped. And we felt they came at us.
Nobody can tell me that he didn't deserve his colours. And he's a fine man. He really is a fine man. Again, the way he played, so he lived.
I think that Doc Craven, unfortunately, his hands were tied. There was such a strong Broederbond situation in the South African Rugby Board that Doc Craven had his hands tied as far as selections was concerned, as far as management and coaches they were concerned, and Doc unfortunately couldn't help anything.
After the tour, South Africa was totally isolated from international rugby. Local competitions were all that spectators could enjoy. Although South Africa was still a member of the IRB, it was cold comfort, and an alternative to an official tour was sought. A rebel rugby tour seemed the only answer.
I'm against the rebel tours. When the Cavaliers came, it was an unauthorized tour. I will never subscribe to pay for play. Never. It will come here. It will come. But not without my concurrence, while I have to say, I'm an amateur and I want to die an amateur.
Then, in 1986, a rebel touring team from New Zealand known as the Cavaliers arrived in South Africa. Thousands of rugby enthusiasts were delighted.
If I had to turn the clock back, I would do it again. And I think if we had to turn the clock back, Doc Craven would do it again. Because here he said, South Africa proved to the world right here, the last test, that they could beat the All Blacks because they were the All Blacks. We restored our pride again in World Rugby.
Verander heeltemal van rigting. Herstel die fout baie mooi en Karel du Plessis. Het vir Koelie Smit aan sy binnekant. En Smit die hardloop en hy moet opkry.
If it wasn't for that tour, I don't know what would have happened to South African rugby. That tour saved us. And that's why I will always be grateful to Dalton's team which came out under all those difficult circumstances.
But at Doc's level, rugby is all about politics, commercialism and professionalism. Camps are often formed and sides are taken, as happened recently when 2 members of the executive were outvoted and 1 walked.
Hitler was a madman, but you can even learn from mad people. He had one very famous saying. He said, every now and then you have to have a purge, a cleanup, and which he applied. And I believe that even in the rugby board, a cleanup was necessary, and that cleanup came automatically.
I still respect him, and I think everybody respects him. I wish I could help him more, but you must remember that I wasn't voted out of the executive, I walked out of it. And then again I walked because we all decided to walk, but 3 stuck to their guns and 3 didn't. The fact of the matter is that I spoke to Doctor afterwards, and even today, he's the most friendliest man I can even imagine to talk to.
Doc's many fine attributes include his moral strength. Through the years, his children from his first marriage grew up with Doc's unshakable values.
There are 2 things that I think that he really tried to teach us, and that is a sense of integrity. That's the one thing I think that I learned from our father. The other is a sense of loyalty. I mean, I know of no person that has got such a sense of loyalty towards the university, towards South Africa. He has a great love for animals, and my brother James brought back, well, it wasn't an Alsatian, some other mixture, and it was supposed to be my brother's dog, and my brother called this dog Bliksem. And in the end, it was my father's dog, it wasn't James's dog. Maybe not perhaps because it wasn't fond of James, because James perhaps wasn't at home that much. But in the end, it was just my father's dog. I'm sure you've heard of Bliksem, and Bliksem used to follow my dad all around the place.
Doc's love for his animals, his rugby and Stellenbosch has been as unwavering as the goals he subconsciously set for himself all those many years ago. Goals motivated by love, not money.
You know, when you look at the rugby player and you want to see if he's a good rugby player, you look to see if he has got reserves. If there are reserves which must be taken out to make him a better player, then you as a coach must take out the reserves. And I feel that I still have a bit of reserve. I think people who are enamored with themselves, who give the ego in them a place that is not warranted, they must be unhappy. My ego is in this place. If they tell me today, look here, Craven, resign, I go out without any ill feeling, and because I'm not doing what I'm doing for myself. That has never come into the picture. I do it for the sake of a cause.
There is still much for Doc to do. The Craven Trust, boosted handsomely from the evening's festivities and auctions, is an ongoing responsibility. Doc still diligently serves the rugby community who love and respect him, both here and abroad.
Ever since I was a small boy in Wales, Danie Craven has always been synonymous with South African rugby.
You know, in South Africa, everybody talks about him as Mr Rugby, but I think the only tribute I can actually give him tonight is by saying that he's Mr World Rugby.
He wants more and he can't get it fast enough. He's a hard taskmaster and he normally gets things done.
Firstly, he's an honest man, direct, and you know where you stand with him.
The genius of the man, that's the one thing that I admire the most. He's a genius.
If I had to pinpoint one strength that Doc has, and that is his ability to change.
I don't think I've ever known anybody as sincere as Doc Craven.
But you felt that he had a command, and more than that, he commanded what I believe is the most important thing for young people. He commanded the respect. And what Danie said, it mightn't have been right all the time. It went.
There's a lovely line of William Butler Yeats, the poet, and I would sum him up in the company of South African players who were here tonight. Yeats wrote a couplet which went, "Think where man's glory most begins and ends, and say, my glory was, I had such friends." Danie Craven is a friend.
On his 80th birthday, Doc can reflect with pride on his enormous contribution to rugby. And what better place to savour those years than amongst his friends here in his beloved Stellenbosch.
Maar ook nog nooit zo dankbaar in mijn hele leven. Dank u.